They say there are fates far worse than extermination, and none prove it truer than a world cursed by the Inquisition. No sirens sound, no banners are raised, no fleets descend in open war. It begins in whispers. A missing cardinal, a vox signal that never returns, an unmarked shuttle that lands in silence. Within days, the sky itself seems to dim. The administratum records vanish, the astropaths fall mute, and an unholy stillness takes hold. Those who live through the first week envy the dead, for death is at least an ending. The curse of the Inquisition is not a single act of vengeance, it is an erasure. A planet judged impure, unfit to exist in the Emperor's light, is not always destroyed by orbital fire. Some are left to rot, forgotten by design, damned to become silent mausoleums where faith decays and sanity dissolves. No one ever knows the reason. Heresy, mutation, or some sin so grave it cannot be spoken aloud. Only one truth remains. When the Inquisition turns away from your world, it does not leave you behind. It leaves you to be unmade.
The first sign was not war. It was absence. No ships crossed the upper atmosphere. No astropathic messages sang through the void. The great administratum relays, once alive with the hum of endless transmissions, now whispered only static. The skies over Carthium Prime, once painted by the golden glare of orbital traffic, had gone still. Even the stars seemed to have dimmed, as though the Emperor's gaze had turned elsewhere. At first, no one noticed. Bureaucrats blamed data corruption. Priests called it a test of faith. And the planetary governor, Lord Halbrecht, continued his morning devotions with the same ritual precision as always. But somewhere deep in the echoing halls of the governor's spire, an Adeptus scribe named Varen noticed the change. He was a thin, gray figure, one of 1,000 faceless clerks hunched over data slates and parchment reels. His duty was routine, copying edicts, filing reports, recording shipments of grain and ammunition for the Astra Militarum garrisons scattered across the equatorial wastes. Yet one morning, as Varen reviewed an inbound request for tithe assessment, he realized no reply had come from Terra, not for a week. Then, too, the delay lengthened, the silence thickened, and when he finally asked his superior about it, the answer came in a whisper. The Inquisition has sealed the channels. No one dared speak the words aloud. To question the Inquisition's will was heresy. To speculate why it acted was death. But silence itself became a message. The Vox arrays and the lower manufactorums began to fail. Their operators found dead at their stations, some from exhaustion, others from wounds self-inflicted in madness. Pilgrim ships bound for the holy shrines in orbit were turned away by unseen orders. Then came the strangest decree of all. The planetary astropaths, the soul-bound servants who carried humanity's voice across the stars, were to remain in their sanctum under lock and ward until further notice. Varen passed the word through the scribal ranks, his voice low and brittle. He told himself this was a temporary measure, some administrative recalibration. But when night fell, and the cathedral bells failed to ring the evening hymn for the first time in living memory, a cold certainty settled in his bones. The Emperor's light had withdrawn. Days passed. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, as if the world were holding its breath. The city's great manufactorums, once roaring with the clang of servitors and the grinding of assembly lines, slowed to a deathly rhythm. Supplies rotted in their silos. Priests delivered sermons to empty pews. In the lower districts, people began to vanish. First workers, then whole families. None returned. Those who dared speak of it whispered that black-robed figures moved through the streets at night, bearing no sigil but the twin-headed aguila burned into flesh. Lord Halbrecht's palace still burned with light, but those within spoke in hushed tones. His court had grown paranoid, divided by fear and suspicion. His governor's personal confessor, Father Cauldron, urged him to declare a planetary fast to prove the world's devotion through suffering. "He tests his faithful," Cauldron said, his eyes bright with feverish zeal. "If he withholds his voice, it is because we have failed to listen." Varen watched from the shadows of the scriptorium as these words spread like contagion. Priests began to scourge themselves in public squares. Children were forced to kneel for hours in silent prayer. The people obeyed, not out of faith, but out of terror, for by now, rumors had begun to crawl through the streets like smoke. The Ordos Hereticus had issued a silent judgment upon Carthium Prime. No one knew the sin. Some claimed a rogue psyker had escaped containment within the catacombs. Others whispered that the governor had bartered relics with Xenos traders. Still others, the most desperate, believed the world itself was infected, not by plague or mutation, but by doubt. In the absence of truth, paranoia became doctrine. By the 13th day, Varen could no longer bear the silence. He ventured beyond the spire walls, through the deserted plazas and rust-choked alleyways of the inner city. The air smelled of ozone and decay. Banners bearing the Imperial Aguila hung in tatters, their edges charred by unseen fire. At the steps of the Grand Basilica, he found a group of penitents kneeling in a circle. Their mouths shone shut with iron wire. Above them, painted in blood upon the marble, were the words, "He no longer hears us." The wind howled through the empty streets like a living thing, and Varen fell to his knees. For the first time he dared to wonder what it meant when the Emperor turned his face away, not in wrath, but in indifference.
The next morning, the bells of the basilica finally rang, but not for worship. Their iron voices told in slow, uneven intervals, echoing across the city like the heartbeat of a dying god. People emerged from their homes and manufactorums, drawn toward the sound with hollow eyes. When they reached the cathedral steps, they saw what remained of the clergy. Father Cauldron and a handful of acolytes, their robes drenched in ash, faces pale beneath the soot. They spoke no sermons. Instead, they unrolled a parchment bound with wax and gold, the sigil of the Holy Inquisition pressed deep into its seal. Cauldron's voice trembled as he read the decree aloud. By the authority of the Ordo Hereticus and the divine mandate of the Emperor of Mankind, the world of Carthium Prime stands under observation. Until the Emperor's will is known, no vessel shall enter or depart, no astropathic signal shall be sent or received. The Emperor's silence is judgment enough. No explanation, no accusation, only that word, judgment. The crowd fell to its knees. Some wept, others screamed. A few, broken by days of fear and hunger, clawed at the cathedral doors, begging forgiveness for sins they could not name. Cauldron watched them, tears streaking the ash on his cheeks, but his eyes gleamed with a terrible certainty. He believed, no, he knew, that salvation could still be earned through suffering. That night the fires began. Across the upper hive, noble families burned their estates, declaring the flames offerings of repentance. The manufactorums of the lower city followed, their workers building pyres from broken machines and servo limbs. Varen watched from a high balcony as the smoke rose in twisting black pillars toward the sky, blotting out the stars. He wanted to scream, to tell them the Inquisition cared nothing for displays of devotion, but his voice failed him. Somewhere, deep inside, he feared that Cauldron might be right, that the Emperor demanded a purging of the soul, no matter the cost. By the 7th night, the governor's palace had sealed itself entirely. Vox contact ceased. Rumor claimed that Lord Halbrecht had locked himself in the throne chamber, surrounded by relics and incense, fasting until the Emperor sent a sign. Others said he had gone mad and executed his entire guard. No one could confirm the truth, for the gates were guarded by black-armored soldiers, silent men bearing no insignia, their visors mirrored, their armor scorched and unmarked. In the streets below, a new kind of faith began to take root, darker, desperate, born not of hope but of dread. Some claim they had seen visions in the smoke, the Emperor's angels weeping blood, or black ships circling in the clouds.
Others heard voices in the static of dead Vox channels, whispering prayers that sounded almost human. And through it all, one phrase spread like a plague: the Inquisition watches. Varen returned to his quarters that night clutching his data slate. He had begun recording everything: the silences, the decrees, the disappearances. His candle guttered in the stagnant air, and for the first time, he noticed the dust on his sleeves. Not the gray dust of the city, but fine black ash that seemed to fall even indoors. He brushed it away, unease prickling at his spine. The air smelled faintly of burned parchment. Then, the Vox in his chamber crackled to life. It was a voice, distant and metallic, speaking a single phrase: "Prepare for purification." Varen froze. The Vox fell silent. He rushed to the window, scanning the horizon, and saw it. A vast shape breaking through the upper atmosphere, its hull black as obsidian, its underside glowing with the crimson heat of descent. Even from miles away, its silhouette was unmistakable: a colossal inquisitorial flagship, descending like an omen of divine wrath. The next day, the planet itself seemed to shudder. Orbital relays disintegrated. Vox towers went dark. The seas boiled where the ship's descent fire met the air. Across the cities, people screamed and prayed, torn between awe and terror. By the time the black ship reached low orbit, its shadow covered half the northern hemisphere. From within its depths came smaller craft, gunmetal gray landers marked with purity seals and sigils of flame. They descended upon the planet like falling stars, each one carrying the Inquisition's servants, stormtroopers, confessors, interrogators, and something worse, agents of the Ordo Hereticus, cloaked in silence and certainty. Varen fell to his knees, hands trembling as the thunder of their engines shook the city. He whispered the catechism of absolution through cracked lips, though he no longer believed it would matter. He had seen what came after the silence. He had seen what the Emperor's gaze meant when it returned. And somewhere deep inside, a thought rose unbidden, one he dared not speak, even to himself. Perhaps it was mercy that he looked away at all.
They came at dawn, when the last bells of the basilica had gone silent, when even the smoke had stopped rising. From the upper atmosphere, the Inquisition ship hung like a wound in the heavens. Its hull was veiled in flame, a dark sun eclipsing the real one. Then the sky split apart. Lines of fire fell like rain. Drop pods, landing craft, penitential shells screaming through the clouds. When they struck the ground, the impact was like a heartbeat that never stopped. Whole city sectors trembled, stained glass shattered, and the ancient aquillas carved into the cathedral walls cracked open down the center, as if the Emperor himself had turned his face away. The first to land were the Arbites. Clad in black carapace armor and carrying shock mauls slick with consecrated oil, they moved through the streets with machine precision. They said nothing. They asked no questions. Every household was sealed, every name checked against the Administratum archives. Those without records, those who had fallen between the ledgers of faith, were dragged into the open and lined up beside the Manufactorum gates. Varen watched from a distance as the first purgations began. The air shimmered with heat from the descent engines. Ashes clung to his hair and uniform. He wanted to look away, but the human eye has a cruel fascination with horror. It demands witness. A woman screamed as her husband was bound and branded with a mark he did not recognize. The Arbites recited a litany as they worked. Ignorance is heresy. Doubt is heresy. Forgetfulness is heresy. Each word struck harder than the flame. By midday, the true agents had arrived. Their lander was black and silent, its insignia carved into the metal in gold, a two-headed aquila with a burning eye at its heart. From its ramp descended figures in robes the color of dried blood, flanked by stormtroopers bearing flamers and meltaguns. At their center walked a single woman, tall and pale, her armor etched with scriptures and purity seals that fluttered in the furnace wind. Her face was half covered by a respirator grill, and her eyes glowed faintly red behind their lenses. Inquisitor Castora Valen. Her name was whispered in the Vox like a curse long before her arrival. It was said she had purged 3 worlds and sanctified 2 with orbital fire. On Carthium Prime, she came not as conqueror, but as executioner.
Valen moved through the streets as though she were walking through a cathedral aisle. Her every step was measured, deliberate, heavy with ritual purpose. At her command, the Arbites opened ranks and knelt. She raised a relic from her belt, a small gilded device humming faintly with psychic power, and pressed it to the air. A wave of invisible pressure rippled outward. The crowd fell silent. Then came the voice, not hers, but something beyond her, something that spoke through her. It filled the streets, the Vox, even the minds of those nearby, resonating with the weight of divine decree. The Emperor sees this world. Its sins are recorded. Its faith shall be tested in fire. Valen lowered the relic. Around her, the stormtroopers moved to obey. Prometheum tanks hissed open. The first flames bloomed like flowers. Varen fled. He ran through the corridors of the upper spire, past portraits of dead governors and rusting Aquillas, his boots echoing on marble floors now cracked by tremors. Outside, the world burned. Manufactorums became furnaces. Hab blocks collapsed under their own melting frames. The air was alive with sound, sirens, screaming, hymns, blending into something like music, a requiem for the damned. He reached the observation deck, high enough to see the full breadth of the Hive City. What he saw would haunt him until his final breath. Fire rolled across the horizon, devouring everything. From orbit, beams of light lanced down like pillars, precise and merciless. They did not strike at random. They burned only the sectors marked days earlier by the data priests, as though guided by invisible hands. Each impact was followed by a shockwave of golden dust. Human remains mingled with melted stone, drifting upward toward the ship like incense offered to a god. Through the Vox came the chants of the Inquisition. Suffer not the unclean to live. The Emperor's mercy is flame. The Emperor's will is silence. Varen fell to his knees. He could taste metal in the air, and beneath it, the faint sweetness of burning flesh. Tears blurred his vision. He no longer knew if he wept for the dead or for the living who still awaited judgment. Somewhere far below, he could hear Cauldron's voice rising from the ruins of the basilica, still preaching even as fire consumed the walls. "We are tested in purity. Burn that we may live again." But Varen understood now. There would be no living again. There was no redemption here, only erasure. As the light of the fires reflected in the tears on his cheeks, he whispered into the smoke, almost a prayer, almost a curse. "Forgive them, Emperor, or at least remember them." The sky answered with thunder.
The first flames were not seen from orbit, but from the slums. Smoke rose where prayers once did. The administratum quarter fell silent when the Vox lines crackled one last time, not with orders, but with scripture, looping endlessly. Only through fire is faith renewed. No one knew whose voice it was. Some said it was the confessors, twisted through static. Others believed it was the Emperor himself, speaking through the machine. Either way, the message spread faster than any command could, and those who heard it began to act. The purge began in whispers, not in gunfire. Families burned their shrines. Priests sealed the church doors from the inside. The people did not flee, they waited, certain that salvation, if it came, would come from the flames. And when the first orbital bombardment struck, there was no panic, only awe. The sky opened like a wound and pillars of white fire rained down upon the manufactorum sectors. The blast did not merely destroy, it sanctified. Those caught within it were not called victims, but martyrs reborn. That was the language of the Inquisition's edict. That was purification. From the hills above the capital, the confessor watched the horizon turn red. His face glowed with reflected flame, tears carving pale lines through soot. Behind him, the scribe who had once recorded imperial decrees now wrote the words of the dead, a litany of names that would never be spoken again. "Faith demands sacrifice," the confessor murmured, though even he could no longer tell if he was quoting scripture or just trying to make sense of the ruin. Somewhere in the city below, the last Vox beacon screamed one final transmission. "The Emperor protects." Then the line went dead. By the second day, the seas boiled. The sky had turned the color of brass, choked with ash. Pilgrims still walked the streets, robes torn, faces lifted toward the heavens as if they might glimpse the Emperor's mercy through the fire. They did not scream when the bombardments resumed. They sang. Hymns of cleansing, verses of devotion rewritten into funeral dirges. Their voices carried through the smoke, echoing between shattered cathedrals. For a moment, the world seemed almost holy, until the sound of impact drowned them out. The confessor's faith broke that night. It wasn't the fire that did it. It was the silence between bombardments, the stillness where he could hear the breathing of the dying, the whispering of those who refused to die. He had once believed that the Inquisition's justice was perfect, that the Emperor's will could never err. But now, as the scribe read aloud another list of purified sectors, millions gone in a day, he realized the truth. The Inquisition did not burn heretics to preserve purity. It burned because it could not tell the difference anymore. Because it was easier to cleanse everything than to question what was worth saving. At dawn, he entered the cathedral that still stood, its spire cracked but unfallen. Inside, the altar had melted, the aquila warped into a dripping shape of gold. He knelt before it anyway. "If this is your will," he whispered, "then let me be next." But no light answered him, only the faint hiss of molten stone cooling and the sound, distant but clear, of orbital guns recharging. When the next bombardment came, the confessor did not flee. He stood upon the cathedral steps as the heavens opened, his robes whipping in the infernal wind, his voice raised in one last sermon to a congregation of ghosts. His words were never recorded, but the scribe who survived claimed to have seen something impossible, that the confessor did not burn. He simply vanished, as though faith itself had devoured him. The bombardments ended after 7 days. When the smoke cleared, the planet was unrecognizable, a wasteland of glass and ash where once stood cathedrals and manufactorums. The Inquisition's ships drifted silently above the dead world, their auspexes sweeping for signs of life. None were found. The message was simple, transmitted across the sector. The Emperor's will is done. Yet somewhere in the ruins, beneath the melted stone of the cathedral, the scribe's data slate continued to flicker, its last line incomplete, pulsing faintly through the ash. Purification is